Hello there, welcome to the Comments, a new collaborative project by Espresso Global and Ukrainian media. I'm Olena Solodovnikova, and it's a great pleasure for me to be joined by Adrian Karatnycky, a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center. Hello, Adrian.
Hello, how are you?
I wanted to start with a big question about the threat for the Europe. The head of Poland military counterintelligence service says that Putin is already ready for the small military operation against the NATO country. He meant one of the Baltic states, for example, to enter Narva. How do you assess this risk?
Well, as it happens, I was in Poland 3 weeks ago and had meetings with the deputy head of Polish intelligence, as well as with the chief of the cabinet of President Duda, as well as with various Polish parliamentarians. And I visited also the American military base in Rzeszów and had a little bit of a sense of the atmosphere. And more recently, I was meeting both in Paris and Marrakesh with French foreign policy experts and so on. So I'm relatively up to date about the mentality of a number of European countries about the emerging Soviet threat, Russian threat, which is very similar in a sense to the Soviet threat. I think we're returning to a period where the vulnerabilities that many countries felt in the Cold War are being replicated by not only Russia's aggression and prosecution of a genocidal war in Ukraine, but also Russia's simultaneous military buildup, which came both in advance and is going to be accelerated to meet the war needs of a much more aggressive Russian state. In Poland, the people that we met with, the Polish leaders, said that Poland is in a pre-war status. And that is a fairly dramatic way of indicating to the broader European public and also to the Polish people the scale of the threat that is present, the scale of the threat if Ukraine does not prevail or if Ukraine does not stop this Russian aggression. And I think this discourse has also extended to other countries, including into what former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld called Old Europe, in contrast to New Europe. New Europe has already been gearing up. All the frontline states are spending above the 2% limit. Some of them, like Poland, have shot up to 4% of GDP for military expenditures, which is a very dramatic increase. France is well above 2% and heading above 2.5%. And President Macron's statement that there may be the necessity to commit French troops to hold the Ukrainian front and to hold significant portions of Ukrainian territory is another example of how deep is the anxiety, and that this anxiety over the Russian threat and the consequences of a Ukrainian defeat what that means for the security and actually the peace of certainly the frontline states and maybe well beyond. One last point, and that is that if you listen to Russian propaganda, or if you listen to the people who listen and absorb all of Russian propaganda, you will see that it is common to speak about the leveling, not just of Ukrainian cities and the eradication of the Ukrainian state, but of nuclear attacks on European capitals, on Berlin and on Paris and so on. And this rhetoric is state-directed, state-controlled, both to prepare the Russian public for further potential aggression, but also to send messages of menace and threat to Europeans in the hope of through fear, winning support from electorates that favor neutrality or favor appeasement for Russia. So that's the general situation we find ourselves in. And yes, there is an assessment that if Russia were ready to carry out an aggression in a neighboring state, maybe not an EU or NATO state such as Moldova, that there would be very little that the West would be able to do in its current posture. And Russia may well be readying for expanding the front, particularly if it meets failure on the Ukrainian front with the new wave of weapons that are coming. Putin may be tempted to expand chaos in the neighborhood and to look for what would be called a low-hanging fruit. If he's not achieving victory in Ukraine, he might be able to put in a friendly regime in Kishinev.
Yes, but if we talk about the little invention, on your point of view, what is the right time for such bold step for Kremlin's, some kind of election in EU country or something else?
Well, I think that the most likely scenario is that it would not first be on an EU country, that Russia might intercede in another country that is drifted away from it. So, for example, Armenia has moved substantially away from being, in a sense, a Russian client state and is seeking to deepen relations, and Moldova. That in itself, just the breaking of another taboo. It's now going to be routine that we can operate in any post-Soviet state with military operations. The taboo has been broken several times, and I think part of the problem of the West is that the West has always preferred to sort of say, well, this was the people in Transnistria who wanted this, or this was the Abkhazians who wanted this, or this was the Ossetians that wanted this, or this was the people of the Donbass that wanted. Russia is not really involved. And so the West for many years was speaking in this kind of language of in outright lies, evading the hard reality of long-term Russian intervention in the near abroad and the Russian military buildup. Russia withdrew from the conventional forces in Europe treaty only, I think, a decade into the Putin administration, and repositioned its forces much closer to mainland European territory. That was met with basically indifference, as if nothing happened. The West ignored the westward movement of Russian deployments, which had heretofore been negotiated and controlled. And you also have to remember that Russia talks about NATO expansion. But what really happened was 200,000 US troops and heavy US weapons were removed from Europe, and a smaller force was left behind. And they were replaced by the militaries of Poland, Romania, et cetera, nothing like the military potential of what was removed. So Russia was motivating its more assertive stance and moving forces forward towards the European border because of NATO expansion. But in fact, NATO expansion was accompanied by a lessening of the military capacity of NATO on European continental soil.
Yes, I totally agree. And about the USSR, would the world really not benefit from the collapse of the Russia? Are there any discussion in the West, particularly in the United States, about the realization of Putin's dream returning to the USSR?
Well, the collapse of Putin's dream is something that I think most of the international community has awakened to and is attempting more or less to answer with maybe not as consistent support for Ukraine as we would hope, but fairly substantial support for Ukraine in the end, after many debates and long processes. But as to Russia's collapse, I think that the collapse of a Putin system, possibly, but I think that more likely the scenario that the West is thinking about is that the Russian people are so manipulated by propaganda and so connected to and either supportive of or indifferent to the state's propaganda that whatever successor regime follows Putin is likely to be more like Putin than more like more like Ukraine or more like the Central European countries. We had that hope that Russia would make that turn in the early 1990s, well, we found that Ukraine's evolution was not as easy as, say, Poland's or Romania's and so on. But in Russia, it never even got off the ground. Ukraine's got off the ground, and it took about a quarter of a century to move Ukraine more or less to where Poland and Eastern Europe were in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of communism. As to Russia, I don't think that a Russian collapse is taken seriously by most analysts, precisely because Russia is a state dominated by, the ethnic Russian nation, as well as Russified non-Russians. So it's hard to see a nation state falling apart on its own, and there are, yes, these republics and autonomous regions, but they number together in, maybe if you add them all up, it's maybe 10 million population, and I think they would not have. They're all landlocked. They would all be surrounded by the heartland of Russia, and I just don't see any way that they could, even if they had the will to separate. They might demand it through peaceful protest, and peaceful protest might inspire some protest against internal Russian imperialism on the part of Russians in the major cities, but I just don't see a scenario where Russia falls apart. I see a scenario where maybe if Russia were dealt a blow in Ukraine, that there would be more protest movements demanding greater share of resources, greater cultural autonomy, and even greater administrative autonomy, greater share of wealth between these autonomous regions. But I just do not see, and I think most of the analytic community is not discussing the possibility of a Russian disintegration into many countries or many political entities.
Sorry for this stupid question, but why hasn't Putin been eliminated yet? On the contrary, the United States recognized Putin as the president of Russia and the presidential election as a fair. Why?
Well, I don't think anyone recognized it as a fair election, but they recognized it as the president of Russia. But I don't think they recognize the Russian president as a democratic leader. They recognize that he is the leader who is in charge as a result of authoritarian policies. They recognize the monarchs of the Gulf states. They recognize many dictators who have come to power with less than public, legislative approval. This is not a judgment about the democracy or the democratic legitimacy of Putin, but it is, I think, an acknowledgement of the fact that he is in charge and he has the command of the state, and we deal with the state, and he is the head of that state. Having said that, he is also subject to international law and to the warrants and claims of the International Criminal Court. So I think that's how they're handling it. Putin is not able, in most cases, to travel, and he is shunned by Western capitals. There was a very low diplomatic presence of heads of state at his inauguration, even though I think they tried desperately. I think they ended up with only nine heads of state, mainly from the former Soviet republics that are dictatorships coming. So yes, I think it was probably a mistake to send the ambassadors of several EU countries to the inauguration. They probably should have sent the political officer to observe and to report, but more in a reporting capacity. But, in the end, Putin is in charge. There was a moment when Prigozhin was on the move where that didn't look potentially as secure, and I think many people do believe that there is something brittle and unstable about the Putin system, but the problem is that until Ukraine is able to shake more that system, we saw how Ukraine's battlefield advances and battlefield efficiency, in a sense, generated the Prigozhin revolt. But then we had almost a year of denying Ukraine adequate resources to prosecute the war and a setback in the counteroffensive, and that had the reverse effect. It made that temporarily made that system more much stronger. And then the other thing that has happened that the West has not paid attention to is that Putin has consolidated a political system that is currently more repressive than statistically more repressive than the post-Stalin Soviet Union, which is to say, there was a study by the group Projekt, which indicated that the number of people in prisons for political charges is higher than at any time in the sort of the period after the release of these hundreds of thousands of prisoners from the Stalin era, when after the Khrushchev thaw. Since that period, more than in any 6-year period of Brezhnev's rule, of certainly of Gorbachev's rule, and of Khrushchev's rule. So this is quite dramatic. We always understood the Soviet Union to be a very repressive society, but politically, this society that Putin has constructed, especially in the last 2 to 3 years, with the additional restrictions on freedom of speech related to the war, to the state, and to the national security structures, and the political killings of his enemies. All of this suggests that, you know, he has recreated and even enhanced the kind of control over society that was enjoyed under his Soviet predecessors.
Yes, I want to make step back to the Ukraine. What is the general mood of the US towards the Ukraine now? Is the fatigue, indifference? Will the recent US aid be the last for Ukraine? Because in Ukraine, we talk about that every time.
Well, first of all, I mean, I can say I spoke with a former Democrat, high-ranking Democratic Party foreign policy official who has served in many administrations. And I won't say which ones, I won't say what age this person is, but this person worked, let's just say, for many years and decades and is familiar with the Democratic Party. And that person said to me that there is more of a likelihood that Trump will get the $300 billion from Russia and use it against Russia than there is that Biden will get it. So I think there will be, if Trump is elected, there is a lot of potential danger that he will do something erratic or force concessions by the Ukrainians that they don't want. But I think he will not allow Putin to do what he wants. And secondly, I believe that he will use, as long as it is the formula that Congress found, which is that this is a loan and maybe it will be forgiven eventually, but he wants to be able to tell his voters and the American people, we're not paying for this. Putin is paying for this, or the Ukrainians are paying for this. We will help them. I think he may be ready to do that kind of provide that kind of help. So I think that the fear of a Trump administration is serious because he is unpredictable. But he may also be unpredictable in a way. Both the upside and the downside, the range of what he could do is very wide. Whereas with Biden, you kind of know where US policy will be. But the upside for Ukraine could potentially be higher in the case of Trump. The rhetoric of getting Europe to pay for its own defenses, that also means that Europe has to spend more money and does become, in effect, more secure if his rhetoric achieves this kind of an increase. Now, Europe is itself much of Europe is doing many of the things that he was urging them to do or extorting them to do in the past. So, but in terms of the general public, yes, I think there is a problem within the Republican electorate that, there is a kind of almost a complete distrust of the national security structures of the United States. Not that people aren't patriotic and Trump voters don't believe in them, they don't love the military, they like the military, they like people who serve the country, but they actually believe that elites have taken over the national security establishment, and those elites they don't care about the lives of American citizens. All they care about are helping corporations to make profits, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all ideas that were before present on the left wing of the American political spectrum. They have slowly drifted into the MAGA Republican wing, and President Trump's son and occasionally President Trump share some of those views. So this is a kind of an anti-American, pro-American politics. In one sense, it's anti-American because it distrusts American institutions, and it's sort of pro-American by saying that we want to concentrate all of our attention on helping the people of the United States. And that is a dangerous trend. Yes, Zelensky is more popular among independents and Democratic voters, and Ukraine is more popular among them than in Republican circles. But I don't think that the tipping point has changed. I would say probably it's 50-50 within the voters among the Republicans, and actually in the House and in the Senate. You saw in the Senate, out of 49 Republicans, I think 28 voted for the bill, so a majority. It was less in the House of Representatives, but I think a lot of those people who voted against did it while really, in effect, supporting aid to Ukraine. They simply felt they knew the vote was going to go through, so they decided they didn't want to be challenged by far-right MAGA, pro-Trump isolationists in primaries or challenged in elections, and preferred to have the safe vote among Republicans was to vote against Ukraine. But I would argue that in the leadership of the House of Representatives, the majority are the vast majority are for Ukraine. And I would say, I'm guessing that even in the Republican caucus, even though the majority of Republicans voted against the aid package, a portion of those who voted against did it for tactical reasons, not because they don't believe that there isn't a Russian threat and that Ukraine couldn't be helped. And if their vote was needed, I think and if Trump was, as he was in this case, quiet or neutral about, and in fact gave his backing to Speaker Johnson, that's another very interesting thing. Trump met with Speaker Johnson. Speaker Johnson outlined what he intended to do with the vote, including the loan package rather than direct budgetary assistance. And Trump backed him at the end of that meeting. He said, "This is my guy. I support him strongly," et cetera, et cetera. Now, two things happened before that gave me a signal that Trump was shifting. One was he had a meeting with President Duda, and I think that meeting had a significant effect on him. Maybe not because of learning the urgency of the Polish assessment of Russian intentions, which he heard, but also the effect that might have on key states such as Michigan or Wisconsin, where there's a big Polish American population, and Illinois, where there are Ukrainian, Ohio, places where he should try to win or needs to win in order to win a very close election. And with all of his legal troubles hurting him with some voters, he made a calculation: I don't want to alienate East European, Central European voters in the United States. So all these things suggest a complicated situation, but not an impossible situation. But yes, there is a risk that Trump could go in a more isolationist direction. I think there would be resistance even among Republicans. You saw that they reasserted long-term commitment to the NATO alliance in a legislative vote, which many Republicans supported. And that was viewed as a vote to, in a sense, preempt Trump coming in and saying that we're either withdrawing or suspending our cooperation with NATO or something like that. So again, to summarize, I think that the situation with Democratic voters and independents and the Democratic legislators is stable and pro-Ukrainian. Among Republican voters, it's 50-50. And among, I would say, the Republicans in Congress is probably a majority. The big question is where Trump would stand if he were elected. But of course, it's not clear that he will be elected. The one last thing that I would say is that Russian propaganda is, I mean, maybe it's deceptive and trying to show that Trump is not the Moscow candidate and trying to help him in that way. But there is not a lot of eager expectation, and there was great disappointment when the Republicans in the end voted this bill. There was great disappointment within Kremlin propaganda circles that the myths that they had been spinning and the hopes that they had had that this isolationist group would take over, that effort failed. And the people who are really strong pro-Putin supporters, they number a handful of members of the Senate and a very small group in the House of Representatives. Yes, there are people who say, well, this is not the US's business, or we shouldn't be spending all this money. But the people who actively support the Russian narrative is a handful of members of Congress like Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yes, in a nutshell, I would like to ask you a little bit about the rumors of that Joe Biden may withdraw his candidacy from the election in favor of the Michelle Obama. It's like
highly unrealistic.
Yes,
the only
yes.
realistic
But
chance would be.
Yes, but my question is that feels like somebody threw spaghetti on the wall and tried how it sticks, and why is it narrative began spread?
Well, first of all, I mean, I do think age is a factor in Biden's chances, and many people feel he is not going to be up to the job in the coming years. But the bigger factor, I think, is the economy. And yes, I think there are people who would like to be in a position, and this whole situation is dictated by the fact that we have a weak vice president. Kamala Harris is not a strong. She has not created a strong image and a strong personality, but she cannot be removed because of political correctness. That is to say, it's hard to remove a woman of color with a Democratic, within the Democratic Party politics. If he had a strong vice president, a new vice presidential candidate, I think his chances would be better because the voters would calculate that if something happens to him, we're okay with this person. That is not the feeling among many voters. If something happens to him, they feel that Kamala Harris would be a weak president, would not be tested, would be tested on foreign policy, would be tested on leadership, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's, so the bigger problem is and that could be remedied. The president could arrange, although in some cases you vote for the electors to vote for a certain candidate at the conventions, but I think the convention could theoretically become open if Kamala Harris were encouraged to remove herself, and that would solve Biden's problem. So I think all these kinds of speculations, they could be from ambitious people who don't want to wait and feel there's a chance to beat Trump and that they could become president. Secondly, the media love tension and stories and rumors, et cetera, and it's kind of boring right now because you know that Joe Biden is running, and you've already done all the stories about his age, his health, and all that. So there isn't anything new. So I think the media always looks for something new. But I think Joe Biden has no intention of doing this, and I also don't think he has any intention of removing Kamala Harris.
Yes, if I can just ask you about a few points of powerful international players. For example, Chinese leader wants to work with France and the entire international community to end of the war in Ukraine. Can China really pacify the Russians and what way?
China has two challenges. Both are dictated by its declining economic growth, which was primarily driven by the real estate sector, which is now a complete mess with bankruptcies, uncompleted projects, et cetera, et cetera. So China's growth engine is stalled. China's banking system, which was linked to that real estate bubble and speculative onward growth, is also complicated. And so I think Xi doesn't want, A, he wants cheap energy, which means Russia, and B, he wants open trade with the West. So I don't see that he will make a decisive move to disrupt either of those. The question is, if he wanted to, could he correct Russian policy? I think Russia would feel terribly isolated if it had to rely on Iran and North Korea and Belarus as its only, and Syria as its, and maybe Venezuela. Okay, those are the countries that would align around, and maybe a little bit Hungary. But if China moved against Russia, Orban would move more towards the EU. So I think all of this is at the moment, I don't see China making, I'm not a China expert, but I don't see China making those kinds of moves. I do think that China could push for for the need for a settlement at some appropriate time, even in this coming year, especially if Ukraine shows a bit of bite back with the reintegration of weapons and munitions and missiles. That could be a moment where there is a push. I mean, China did say that they're going to try to control dual-use weapons going to Russia. We know that that's very hard to do, but they are not selling currently weapons to Russia. That has been confirmed by intelligence services, and that's an important factor. I think China is important also as a restraint of the Russian use of tactical nuclear weapons. China does not want to see something like this. China believes that Russia will not use those kinds of weapons. That I think President Xi and his circle are very confident in, but partly because they themselves have created a red line for Russia. So China is not playing a completely negative role, but Mao was the heir of Stalin, and he broke with the Soviet Union because it was rejecting the Stalinist authoritarian communist system, and he didn't like what Khrushchev was doing. But in 1947 or 48, there was a remarkable vote in the Security Council about authorizing the use of an international force to fight a war in Korea, to defend South Korea from communist Korean invasion. The Soviet Union was on the Security Council and did not attend that meeting. And it was considered, many people believed it was a mistake, that they weren't there and to do a veto because it allowed the US to build an international force that stopped the North Koreans. But in documents that were revealed eventually, Stalin's correspondences with his diplomats, it was shown that Stalin didn't want the Soviet Union to vote because he wanted to drag the United States into a European war, and that expenditure of energy and time would give Russia more influence in Europe to expand its reach in Europe. And I think China feels the exact reverse. They want the United States to be absorbed today in a war in Europe and the problems of Europe so that it cannot expend resources to keep China in check in Asia. And so that is, I think those are while we cannot know what is in the mind and in the heart of President Xi, I think all those factors are operating.
Yes, this is very interesting historical parallel. And for the end, I wanted to ask you about Israel. And in fact, Joe Biden has promised not provide military assistance to Israel if the troops carry out the large-scale invasion of Rafah, but they have done it. What is the U.S. trying to play? Is a neutral position or in this conflict?
Well, I mean, the United States will be with Israel. Israel is not facing a shortage of weapons. This is additional resources. It's fighting a Hamas military, which has very limited, throw potential. They can do mass killings and they can lob rockets and Katyushas and all of this sort of thing and mortars onto Israeli territory, and they can eventually restart terrorist operations and blow up Israelis in pizzerias as they used to do, as the PLO used to do. but first of all, it allows, the reason this is done is one, some measure of pressure on Netanyahu, who is not prosecuting this war in the most intelligent way in the eyes of the vast majority of human beings, including many Israelis. But to have Israel understand that it will have this capacity at some point in the future. So if they're expending their weapons, knowing that once this is over, these resources will come. Secondly, it allows Biden to show that he is trying to pressure Netanyahu, because there's a lot of unpopularity in how Netanyahu is running the war in the United States, and particularly among a portion of Democratic voters and young Democratic voters on whom, in a close election, Biden is reliant. I have a view that, I don't have a great deal of sympathy for Hamas, nor for the people of Gaza, because they support Hamas, and they supported them electorally, and they seem to have supported them throughout their long, murderous career. So I have as much sympathy I don't think very much about the citizens of the Germans of Dresden during the Second World War, though it was terrible that their city was bombed. I don't cry when I see the ruins of Berlin in historical documentaries, and I don't cry when I see what is happening in the West Bank, because I feel that Hamas is a smaller but latter-day equivalent of Hitler's Nazi regime, intent on the elimination of Jews and the Jewish state and the Jewish presence in the Middle East. That is what they want. They want the depopulation. They want, the ethnic cleansing and the murder of the Jews who remain on that territory. So I personally don't have a great deal of sympathy, but I do understand that there are humanitarian losses. But as I say, I have more sympathy for the West Bank, which has elected a more responsible leadership and supports a more responsible leadership. And I recognize that Hamas is, maybe because of its demagogy and control of media, that it, like Putin, is in. But I see the Palestinians in Gaza with the same sympathy that I see Russians in Russia, or the Germans who supported Hitler. So that means not a great deal of sympathy.